good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jenny and I'll be facilitating today's event. And today I'm joined by James and Holly from the Change team and Anton from the Performance Assurance team. So just before we get started, I want to go through some housekeeping with you. So we ask that you keep your cameras and your microphones off throughout this event. The event will be recorded, so you'll have an opportunity to refer back to the recording and the slides when they're made available on the rec portal. We'll also be using Slido. The QR code is on the screen now. So please follow the joining instructions if you'd like to ask any questions. And as I mentioned, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please type them into Slido. So I'll just leave that QR code on the screen for a moment and let everybody join. And just now that's out the way, I will share the agenda with you all. And I'll hand over to James Hardy.
Thank you, Jenny, and good afternoon, everyone. So for those that don't know me, my name's James Hardy, and I am a change analyst for the Retail Energy Code Manager, and have been the lead analyst for change proposal R0155 Change of Occupier, Evidentiary Standards and Timescales. So we've put this webinar in place today to sort of give an overview of what R0155 is, the work that has gone into the change proposal, and the key requirements and preparations for REC parties ahead of implementation of this change proposal on the 27th of June later this year. Just start off by giving some thank yous as well. So thank you for the comms team and Jenny for setting up this webinar today. We do hope that it will be of use for all attendees moving forward ahead of the implementation. And also thank you sort of to the wider code manager team, so the subject matter experts of Lorna and Glenn, and Holly as our change and release manager, and REC Performance Assurance, who you'll hear from later, and REC Technical Services, who will be assisting in the implementation of R0155. I know some of you will be sort of engaging with this 155 for the first time today through this webinar, but I know many of you on the call as well as have engaged throughout, whether that be through the impact assessment and the consultation that took place, or via the working group that took place in early 2024. And we'd like to take this moment to thank all of the members of that working group for their input, their opinions, experiences and expertise as part of that working group that has allowed us to complete a solution for the change of occupier, evidentiary standards and timescales, see it through the change process to authority approval that was gained on the 4th of February, and now allowing us to move forward to the implementation later this year. So if we have next slide, please. Before we get into some of the key requirements ahead of that implementation, I'll give a bit more further overview of what 155 is and what has previously happened. So in the non-domestic market, I'm sure all aware that the non-domestic change of occupier process is a pain point for consumers, suppliers, and many other stakeholders as well. And a previous citizens' advice survey highlighted that between August 2023 and 2024, 17% of non-domestic cases that came through their consumer service were coded as non-domestic contract issues. This can be sort of to do with deemed rates, issues with getting confirmation of the change of occupier process, confusion around the required evidentiary documents that a supplier may request, amongst many others. So it's become one of the most common issues in the code concerns with consumers and the change of occupier process. And it's been ongoing for years, and it was sort of really reached a point where we needed to try a way of addressing this to improve consumer outcomes and also improve the process for suppliers and other market participants. It was also highlighted in Ofgem's non-domestic market review and their December 2023 statutory consultation that set out sort of a wider number of issues with the change of occupier process, both when there is a switch and without a switch within that process. From that review, an expectation was set that these issues could be addressed through the REC, and that's when the change proposal R0155 was raised in December 2023. In the build-up to that, RECO, so the Retail Energy Code company, who oversee the Retail Energy Code, undertook some work to identify some potential solutions to the change of occupier and process, and he's presented to an industry workshop in 2023. Following engagement there, none of these solutions were taken forward, and the direct change proposal that was raised without a solution, and it was left to the code manager to work with industry through the working group I touched upon, and further stakeholder engagement, to sort of consider what could the REC do, what could the REC bring in to sort of try and improve the change of occupier process. So that's when we started to facilitate the R0155 work group to allow members from across Ombudsman and Ofgem all contributed to sort of discuss together and work as a sort of a wider industry-wide collective to come up with some suggestions. The outcomes from this work group have been developed into a solution that introduces a non-exhaustive list of evidentiary documents and SLAs for energy suppliers to review documents that are submitted. This solution has now progressed all the way through our change process and is the one that will be implemented on the 27th of June. So to recap what has happened, on the left-hand side of your screen there, so following the change proposal being raised, we held the working group and the webinars and the engagement before that. The solution then went through a legal review and a service provider impact assessment before being issued for industry impact assessment. And then in October 2024, we reviewed the business case assessment and continued to engage stakeholders to finalise the solution before the industry consultation and further legal review in November 2024. We presented the final change report to the REC Change Panel in December 2024, where they voted to recommend that the authority approve the change proposal and the solution that we set out. And this was received on the 4th of February this year. So the next steps for the 155 and the change of occupier process that will be taking place in 2025, we obviously have the implementation, and we will be providing the continued stakeholder guidance, including a webinar like this today. Ahead of that, there'll be the ongoing review of the change of occupier process as well, because we're aware that this change proposal only touches a very small part of the process, and there will still be issues that arise with it that we will look to address as time progresses. There'll also be further changes towards the SDEP and performance assurance around the change of occupier process, and we'll touch upon them later in this webinar. So that's an overview of sort of how we got here and what's happened previously. So if I can have the next slide, please. Now move into some of the key requirements for REC parties, and this will detail more of the approved solution and the requirements once implemented and ahead of implementation as well. It is key to note that this change proposal only places requirements on energy suppliers, and it's energy suppliers who will be expected to complete some actions ahead of implementation. However, this information is beneficial for all market participants to ensure that everyone across the industry is aware of the new process and aware of the expectations, and also to provide reassurance to stakeholders that the parties will be prepared ahead of the implementation later this year. So if we can have the next slide, please. So the first thing that you'll see within the REC come implementation is a new REC schedule, and this will be the non-domestic change of occupier schedule. This schedule will set out the solution and will introduce a non-exhaustive list of evidentiary documents that may be used to demonstrate that a change of occupier may have taken place. Alongside this, there's the introduction of a 10 working day service level agreement, SLA, for energy suppliers to review any documentation that is submitted, whether this be by a consumer or a third party intermediary or other, and communicate the outcome with whoever submitted the evidence. So within those 10 working days, the energy supplier will have 10 working days from the receipt of documentation to accept the change of occupier request, reject the request, or to return to the consumer or TPI to confirm if they have any queries on that documentation or whether additional information is required. The energy supplier, if they return asking for further information or further documents will have an additional 10 working days on the receipt of any requested additional evidence to confirm their decision. And just to confirm, because I know there has been some confusion around this point, that is, if an energy supplier requests additional documentation, they have 10 working days to review that from the receipt of that additional documentation. So it's not including the initial 10 working days, and the 10 working days doesn't include the time that the consumer takes to respond with that further documentation. So effectively, every time a new piece of documentation is submitted, that 10 working day SLA resets. The non-exhaustive list is set out in the schedule that is available on the REC portal and will obviously be fully implemented at the point of implementation. And prior to implementation, parties, obviously particularly energy suppliers, are expected to have trained the staff on how to review documents in line with the R0155 solution. On the left-hand side of the screen here, you'll see sort of a table summarising the different actions and who the obligations are on, and whether it is involved in the change of occupier with a switch or the change of occupier without the switch. So the non-exhaustive list of evidentiary documents may be referred to and may be used both for change of occupiers with a switch and without switch, and will be used by both the existing and gaining supplier. The 10 working day SLA for reviewing documents without a switch with the existing supplier, and so we'll be following the rest of that process within SLA, reach an outcome as well, and then communicate to the consumer or whoever submitted the evidence. If there is a switch, then the gaining supplier, on receipt of a switch objection with a change of occupier flag, passes the evidence to the losing supplier, and this will be done through SDEP, which I'll touch upon shortly. And then 10 working day SLA for reviewing documents, and that decision whether to accept or reject will be on the existing supplier as well. And then the existing and gaining supplier within that SLA will communicate the decision with the existing consumer and the gaining supplier. If we have the next slide, please. So as I said, SDEP will be used to share the evidentiary documents that will be involved in this process. So for those of you that may not have heard of SDEP before, it is the Secure Data Exchange portal, and it is the REC secure means of sharing data. We had hoped that there will be a specific process type screen for this. So there'll be a new screen titled non-domestic change of occupier, one for gas and one for electricity, that would be used to share documents when there is a switch, and obviously dependent whether it's gas or electricity. But due to the impacts of the MHHS market half-hourly wide settlement code freeze, a dedicated set of process type screens have not been made available immediately. So in the interim, energy suppliers will be required to use the PT0056 duplicate meter points general query for gas, and PT0067 duplicate meter points general query electricity screens to share these documents. We have placed careful consideration onto these screens as part of the 155 change process, and we've explored possible other options within SDEP as well. But because these are the existing screens with the least traffic, we have decided that this will be the interim solution until the new SDEP screens can be implemented, and I'll touch more upon that later as well. The key bit with this, because we want to make sure that the consumer's data is shared efficiently and safely and securely, we have mandated the use of SDEP for all energy suppliers. So in the non-domestic change of occupier process, whenever documents are shared between the gaining and existing supplier, they will be required to use SDEP and the screens that we have set out. We'll touch on a little bit more on SDEP as well, and some further support that we will be providing on the use of SDEP a little bit later on. If I can have the next slide, please. So there's three sort of key parts of the change as well and the requirements. So I've covered off the new schedule and SDEP, and then the third part, which again is for energy suppliers only, but will be of interest to wider REC stakeholders, especially when it comes to ensuring that increasing confidence that the energy suppliers are following these new obligations, are the performance assurance requirements. I'll touch on these briefly, but I do have Anton from the REC performance assurance team who will cover off this in a little bit more detail later. But as an overview, so the REC Performance Assurance Board, some of you will have heard of them as PAB, requested 2 activities as part of the performance assurance of 155 and the change of occupier process. So firstly, they requested that there be assurance before implementation to gain confidence that parties are ready to operate in line with the changes that are being made to the REC. Again, we'll touch on this a little bit further, but this will be key for all REC stakeholders to be aware of, because this assurance activity will ensure that energy suppliers are following these requirements ahead of implementation, and once this is implemented, that actually the process will be operating smoothly and energy suppliers will be following the new obligations. After that, there will be ongoing monitoring to identify outliers or anomalous behaviour, but as part of this assurance, one requirement that is no longer in the change is energy suppliers are not required to produce any reports as part of R0155. So the assurance before implementation will take place via an information request, and this has already been issued on the 6th of March to all licensed energy suppliers supplying non-domestic premises. The information request will require parties to respond to a set of questions which will help them outline the steps they have or will take to implement these required changes. As for the ongoing monitoring, the data sources will be the switching data received from the Central Switching Service, CSS, and data on the non-domestic change of occupier process will additionally be provided alongside the planned Ofgem reporting requirements. Some of you will be aware of this Ofgem request for information that is currently out. We will be reviewing the outcome of that RFI and seeing where we can align with the change of occupier process to see if the data can be used for both purposes. This Ofgem reporting isn't yet available because obviously it is out for RFI and there is a lot of dependency behind that. But the code manager will raise the additional REC change proposal to incorporate the Ofgem reporting into the assurance at a later date, if obviously that RFI proceeds in a way that allows us to do so. If you are a supplier who is currently completing that Ofgem request for information, whilst our intention further down the line is to have it linked to the 155 change of occupier process, at this point, until that a subsequent change proposal has been raised and implemented, there is no need to provide this reporting to REC at this stage. But I will touch a little bit more on that and the subsequent change proposal later on in this webinar. So I saw that a few of you joined late, so may have missed the Slido QR at the start. So anyone that didn't have a chance to join the Slido for the question and answer session at the end of the webinar, if we leave this up just for sort of 10 or 20 seconds to allow anyone that hasn't joined yet a chance to access the Slido, and then we will continue.
Thank you, James. And just on that, there is also a tab at the top of your Teams, at the top of this Teams meeting that you can also click on and ask questions through there.
Jenny? Hopefully everyone's had a chance to join the Slido now. And now I'm going to pass over to Holly, who is our change delivery and release manager, to give a bit more overview of the REC release process for those that may not be aware.
James. Afternoon, everybody. My name's Holly. I am the change delivery and release manager for the REC. And I thought it might be useful just to go through the release process for those of you that aren't familiar with it. Can we go on to the next slide? Thank you. So this is a generic release and includes the activities that typically take part as a release. And it's not just specific to R0155. This is a release that will include multiple change proposals that go into that release. So once a CP is approved, it goes into a release plan. So once it's targeting a release, there'll be other change proposals that are also targeting that release as well. So the release plan contains an overview of all of the change proposals that are going to be included within that release. Once we know a change proposal is approved, if there are any system changes, then we'll begin building those system changes. For R0155, of course, there aren't any system changes, but there will be other change proposals targeting that release that will include system changes. If there are any impacts to the data spec, we'll do a data spec pre-release for that particular release. We'll also do a release drop-in session, so closer to the time, so closer to the June release, I will be running a release drop-in session, and within that drop-in session, we'll go over each of the change proposals targeting that particular release, including 155, the impacts, and what products are going to be updated. We'll also start preparing the schedules and the products, so any impacted products as part of that release, we'll start preparing those and doing quality reviews on them before we release them. And if there are any change proposals that need testing, so they will be things like system changes, we do conduct test assurance for those particular changes as well. We also do a pre-release comms, so via the weekly bulletin and the change bulletin, we will release comms in there. If you're not subscribed to the both of the bulletins, you can do that, and we'll share information on how to do that at the end, but it is a good idea to get subscribed to those. And then before the release, we'll hold a go, no go. The purpose of that go, no go is just to make sure we're ready, everything's gone smoothly, and we'll call a go or a no go for that particular release. And then everything goes into the release. On the release date, you can expect all the schedules or the products uploaded to the portal, and they'll be ready for you. We'll update the portal pages for each of the change proposals, so everybody knows that they've been released on that particular day. We will communicate via the bulletin, and also we'll update Digital Navigator, which is the digital version of all of the schedules, and Erin, which is the bot that you can ask questions to. It's a chat bot, and you can ask any questions, and they'll come back with either the schedules or answers to your questions or point you in the right direction. So we'll make sure all of that is done on the release date. As I said, just a high-level overview of the release. I'll hand back over to you, James.
Thank you very much, Holly. So obviously we're aware that for many parties, this is the first time that you'll be following a release and sort of following the change process and the change proposal. And we do, as the code manager, want to make the process as easy as possible for everyone. So we have ensured that we provide as much assistance as possible around R0155. So if I can have next slide, please. I'd like to highlight some of the additional documents that we have available for party to use, that will be available not just between now and implementation, but also post-implementation as well. These resources can be used by anyone, so it's not just sort of your potentially your operations managers, but also your change of occupier teams, and even some of your energy supplier agents that may be dealing with consumers around the change of occupier process. So the first one that those that have followed the 155 change process closely will be aware of is the additional guidance document that we have written and published as part of the change process. It is an additional resource, however, it is not a mandatory requirement to follow, and this document can be updated by the code manager as required. The document sort of covers additional evidentiary documents that may be used, some sort of case studies of peculiar cases that may be more tricky to resolve, and further guidance around sort of STEP as well. So the main non-binding guidance document is titled R0155 Non-Domestic Change of Occupier Guidance, and this will be available on the REC portal page. This guidance document was requested by the R0155 working group to support the progression and implementation of this change proposal, providing additional information to the schedule that will be introduced. Doesn't override the schedule or any of the obligations in 155, but is there as an additional resource for wider teams to use. So far to date, it has been very well received. And if there is any further feedback on this guidance document or anything else you would like us to include beyond sort of the examples set up there, so the supplementary list of documents, examples and scenarios, and support with SDEP, we'll be happy to engage around that to ensure that the guidance document is fit for purpose and covers all the additional help that you may require. There is also a second guidance document that is purely focused on the performance assurance approach, and this is kindly being provided by our REC performance assurance team, and this is titled Updates on the Performance Assurance of R0155. Similarly to the main guidance document, this can be updated by the code manager as and when, and will be updated when we know a bit more about the performance assurance approach following the Ofgem reporting as well. Both of these guidance documents are available to download on the R0155 REC portal page, and any updates will also be uploaded to that page as well. Can I have the next slide, please? So alongside those guidance documents as well, for the performance assurance, there will be an additional drop-in session webinar during the information request window to assist energy suppliers with any questions or difficulties they may be facing with that information request. But I know Anton will be touching on that a little bit more shortly. And then on SDEP as well, especially for people that may be using SDEP for the first time, energy suppliers and everyone else, because it will be on the REC portal, will have access to the Secure Data Exchange Portal SDEP user guide to assist with the use of SDEP. Currently, the version on the portal is 4.1, but we will be publishing a new version of this very shortly that will cover the uses of the PT screens that are being used for the non-domestic change of occupier process in the interim. So the link at the moment is for the existing document, but if you have any difficulties with that link in a couple of weeks' time, it will be because there's a new version, but this can be found easily on the REC portal simply by searching the title in the search bar. We've also updated an SDEP training slide deck that had previously been used in the REC for previous changes. It now sort of covers the most up-to-date uses of SDEP and factors in the change of occupier process. This is available on the REC portal and can be found on the R0155 REC portal page. For registered REC parties as well, you'll also be able to engage with your operational account manager, your RAMs, who will be able to assist with any queries. If you can speak to them, they'll pass you in either over to us to speak to, or point you in the right direction on the REC portal or other areas. Alternatively, parties can also raise their queries and questions through the service desk on the REC portal, or email us at inquiries@recmanager.co.uk. Because of the interest in 155 and sort of the wide range of parties that are taking an interest, we will be providing as many updates as we can via the REC portal, LinkedIn, and our weekly REC bulletins. So we've got a main REC one, and we also have a REC change bulletin as well. This is probably the easiest place to get all the information, and not just for R0155, but for sort of wider REC work as well. And if you'd like to subscribe to these bulletins, if you drop an email to inquiries@recmanager.co.uk, again, they'll be more than happy to get you on those mailing lists. Can I have the next slide, please? So I just want to touch upon sort of what happens next as well, sort of the post-implementation. So far I've touched upon SDEP having interim screens and sort of potentially a change to the reporting requirements following an Ofgem request for information. So I just want to touch upon these as some of them are already in progress. So if we can have the next slide, please. So the first one is already been raised as REC issue 0232, so non-domestic change of occupier SDEP screens for the R0155 solution. So as I touched upon earlier, we couldn't create dedicated change of occupier SDEP screens due to the impacts of the MHHS code freeze during the 155 solution. And we didn't want to delay the implementation of 155 until these screens were available, either due to the levels of consumer detriment that is currently being faced in the change of occupier process. Hence, we brought in the interim solution, but we are working hard as quickly as possible as well to create these newly dedicated screens. So 232 has been raised to develop these screens, and should this issue progress, which it is now progressing following the authority approval of 155, the new dedicated screens will obviously replace the temporary workaround for the 155 solution. We have begun the solution analysis and sort of getting an idea of requirements for these S-step screens through the REC change issues group. So we presented in the February meeting, presented sort of a potential list of what may be included in the screen and the different information items that suppliers may require. By doing this now, it ensures that when we are able to build the screens following or sort of once the impact of the MHHS code freeze are no longer there, we will be proceeding as quickly as possible. And perfectly timed as well, we will be issuing a party impact assessment on the requirements for these new screens to energy suppliers tomorrow on the 14th of March, and we will be looking for engagement through that to sort of help us further decide what needs to go on the screens and whether the information that we are expecting to be included on the screens is sufficient or whether further information or items will be required. Again, by having that party impact assessment now, it will allow us to progress with these new screens as quickly as possible when the impacts of the MHHS code freeze do allow us. As I said, there's a portal page set up for that as well, and we will be bringing this back to Change Issues Group in coming months as well. So there'll be plenty of opportunities for engagement and further assistance around this as well. Next slide, please. And so, as I touched upon earlier, once the Ofgem or non-domestic request for information has concluded, obviously, dependent on the outcome and dependent that is taken forward, the code manager will raise an additional REC change proposal to consider incorporating the Ofgem reporting into the ongoing assurance of the change of occupier process. What that would look like is that the information, again, requested by Ofgem is the same as what the code manager intends on requesting. So this would reduce the need to make two separate reports using separate data and separate data items, so easing the burden on suppliers. It is expected that the code manager will backdate the reporting data from the point of implementation if the Ofgem requirements allow. However, that will all be confirmed during the issue change proposal process for the reporting change, obviously if it does go ahead. Once a decision is known and if it is raised, this will be communicated through the REC portal and the weekly REC change bulletins, and then it will be open as well to the standard REC change process, which will allow for all stakeholder engagement as well. So sort of watch the space on this one. This will be all sort of confirmed after the June implementation, but it's worth being aware of now just in anticipation of future changes to the assurance reporting. If I can have the next slide, please. I think I'm now going to pass over to Anton, who is the lead of our REC performance assurance team, who will talk through a little bit more in details about the assurance that has been introduced and sort of the activities that are taking place between now and implementation. So Anton, if I can pass over to you.
Thanks very much, James. So before we get into it, I just wanted to talk about why we're thinking about this change having probably a bit more assurance than your average change. You know, there's been more than 155 changes raised, but this is one of the ones with a greater extent. So if we can just flip on to the next slide. This is a really important activity that generates a lot of consumer benefits. The business case for improvement's compelling, and we want to know that the change has achieved its benefits. But actually, it's really important that REC stakeholders are confident that there are things to make sure these things are these procedures are in place. I think it builds trust that suppliers who are putting in place the things to respond to these changes know that other suppliers are doing that, and it builds trust for consumers that they know that these things are checked before go live. This is a really subtle change, actually. It's quite complicated, and James and the team have come up with a subtle solution that needs to protect the interests of the consumer, the gaining supplier, and the losing supplier. So actually, it's not quite as simple as you might think for us to know that it's all working. So actually, these are the key reasons why we're focusing on this change. if we move on to the next thing, we want to think about two elements here. One's assuring the implementation and one's ensuring the enduring operation. So this slide talks about assuring the implementation. So why do we need to do this? I think firstly it's really important, but this is an area that you need confidence if you're a supplier that other suppliers are doing this too. And I think that's a really important thing. And the PAB needs confidence that the market will be ready for these important new processes. So the thing that the PAB focused a lot on is the importance of prevention instead of remediation. And the thing that we can do in advance is understand people's readiness. So they asked us to do an information request. This is focused on three things: updates to internal operating procedures and training. It focuses on system readiness and internal monitoring and management oversight. So people are checking that the processes are working as intended. And if you have a problem, maybe you have some people off sick or something's not quite going right, the management can identify it and kind of get involved and fix it. We recognise that these information requests do represent a lot of effort for those who are filling them in, and that is happening at the same time as you have to implement an important change. That is like quite tricky. So we do recognise that there are a lot of costs and effort associated with this, and we think it's really important that the code manager plays its part in communicating properly and giving plenty of opportunities for support. So we issued an information request very quickly after we got the approval for the change, and we've put the timeline on the bottom. So the information request was issued to relevant parties on the 6th of March. And obviously things like today's discussions and some of the documents James was talking about, and the signalling of the information request in the change will have allowed people to prepare and have quite a good idea of what we were intending. We don't think that's enough, though. We want to make sure you have enough opportunities beyond the standard opportunities of, your OAM and your inquiries service to engage with us and us to help where you have challenges. So we're going to put in a drop-in session kind of halfway through the information request period. So this drop-in session will be an opportunity for you to ask if you didn't understand exactly what we were driving at with a question, or if you thought there were maybe two things you could do to respond to that and you weren't sure which one would be the right one. Come and talk to us about any queries you have, resolve them as nice and quickly and in advance, so that by the time you're submitting your information request, it's as good as it can be. We will then be reviewing this throughout May, and it is possible when you fill in your request that there's a bit that either doesn't quite make sense or doesn't quite answer it in full. So there is a possibility of follow-up. Clearly, we will only follow up where that is necessary. We're not seeking to follow up, we're just seeking to get to the quality and assurance level that we do require. We are hoping that there is a closure of this performance assurance technique by June, and that any organisations who are still struggling to meet the requirements, they may have bespoke action plans developed or some support, particularly where people sometimes implement things wrong because they didn't understand them or the guidance wasn't clear enough. If we find that there are cross-cutting challenges, maybe everybody didn't understand a thing or anything like that, we will update the FAQs, update the comms, update the guidance, and if really required, put on some more engagement sessions or drop-in sessions to make sure that we help steer the market to the most successful implementation we can. If we go on to the next slide. The next slide is thinking about after implementation. So it's really important that we get trust that these things are effective on an ongoing basis. And one of the things that I do in my job is to think about how much time we have to dedicate to each different area. So we can tell you what we plan on doing after go live based on the implementation request. And this will be varied over time, depending on how effective the market is at picking up these changes. So if the market is really, really healthy, this resolves loads of consumer and supplier issues, we may dial this down. If there are lots of challenges faced, we may dial it up. So the first thing that we intend on doing is looking at the switching data received from CSS, which relates to objections for non-domestic switches with the change of occupier flag set true. We obviously need to let the market run a little bit so people are familiar with these processes. There is an evidential trail and we can see what's working and what's not. We will be looking at that, and the intended approach will be to sample organizations whose use of the coup flag, there's a lot of activity there, or perhaps there's a risk there, and then to look at the substantive evidence behind that to see if they are operating in line with the code. We do expect, as James has said in advance, to enhance this with better data. The purpose of getting better data is to get more efficiency on both sides. This means that we can target our work in areas where there are more likely to be problems, so that there are less generic information requests. There are less generic requests for substantiation for organizations who may well be doing very well, because we can target our interventions. This will be based on information that Ofgem intend to collect as part of an RFI, and there will be an associated change to firm this up and put this in the performance assurance reporting catalogue. The intention of using this data is to try and use data that suppliers have already had to put effort and time into collating and reporting. That will help refine our work. This is preferred because overall it has a lower impact on the industry whilst being able to substantially improve our work. That obviously is linked though to making sure we get exactly an understanding of what RFI is and codifying that into the rec. I guess the key point that we want to share is that we intend to do this. So if you are building reporting for that, build with this requirement in mind and watch that change as it goes through the change process. So those are the things that I wanted to cover. I think if we move on to the next slide, and I'll just hand back to James.
Thank you very much, Anton. Really useful overview of the assurance there. And sort of just to reiterate some of what I was saying earlier about the Code Manager Assistant and what Anton touched upon in the end there, is that there will be plenty of assistance provided on the assurance as well through those drop-in sessions, further sessions if need be, and guidance documents as well. So before we sort of wrap up the session and move on to the Q&A, I just want to give an overview of the key dates and activities, sort of as a reminder and awareness. So the two key bits that have already happened, the 4th of February, the authority determination was received, and that sort of gave the green light for what R0155 to proceed towards implementation as part of the REC student release. On the 6th of March, the performance assurance information request that was just mentioned was issued to the energy suppliers with licenses for non-domestic premises. 13th of March, obviously, we're all here today to sort of discuss this process and what happens next. And then for energy suppliers on the 2nd of May, that performance assurance information request deadline. And as Anton just touched upon, following that, the performance assurance team will review those responses and engage with energy suppliers further if needed. 27th of June is the key date where change proposal R0155 will be implemented into the REC. So whilst some energy suppliers may start to follow the new process, the new documents and SLAs before then, from the 27th of June, the obligations will be in play and sort of the assurance as well will fully begin. And obviously, the 27th of June isn't the end of sort of the REC's work on the change of occupier process, because post-implementation, we will be having the progression of issue 232 to introduce the dedicated non-domestic change of occupier screens. And we'll obviously have the outcome and further work on the Ofgem reporting And we will be reviewing, obviously, the solution as well in due course to make sure that actually has it met its purpose? Is it working as intended? Or is there other areas that we could look at and explore as the code manager to improve the change of occupier process to help reduce consumer detriment and make it easier for energy suppliers and all those that do engage with the change of occupier process? As I said, if all these dates are in our rec change bulletins as well, and we will be sending out reminders through that and any further updates on any changes of the dates, not that we're expecting any. So please do sign up to them if you haven't done so already to keep up to date with the key dates and activities. Next slide, please. I think that was the last one. So yes, so we're going to move on to the question and answer session now. You can see that a few questions have been provided already, and hopefully sort of a large amount of questions that you all had at the beginning of the session we have been able to answer. But if not, we will take the opportunity now. We do ask that if possible, the questions are kept to sort of the implementation and the requirements of 155 due to time. We are happy to answer other questions around the wider change of occupier process, obviously after the session. And we will be publishing all these questions that are submitted or so most of them, we'll group them and theme them to create a frequently asked questions document as well that we will be publishing. I think most people have added their names as well. That was only me I ever ask. If you could add your name where possible as well, please. It will allow us to reach out after the session to have further conversations and further clarify if need be as well. So I think so myself and sort of our subject matter experts and Anton for performance assurance are on hand to help answer. I think Jenny, you have control of the Slido, yeah?
I do, yes.
Yeah,
So
perfect.
I guess
So-
we can start from the top down.
Yeah. So a couple of these have been answered on the Slido. So some of you will see these already, but I'll just repeat it for the recording and in case you haven't had a chance to look at them. So the first question, can I clarify that if two documents from the evidentiary list are provided, can the supplier request additional documents? And if so, how many times can they ask? So if the supplier does not initially accept the documentation provided, they have to set out in writing why they haven't accepted this documentation and the steps that need to be taken for the documentation to be accepted. If that includes additional documentation to proceed with the change of occupier request, they have to include that justification for the additional request. R0155 doesn't set a limit on the number of times, but it is clear that they do need to be reasonable requests. The second question there, yes, the recording will be available after the presentation. We'll put it on the rec portal within the next 3 working days, along with the presentation slide and the FAQs document as well. And once it is published, we'll raise awareness through the wiki bulletin and our LinkedIn page as well. Changes applicable to all non-domestic customers regardless of their business size? The answer is yes for that one. It applies to the change for all the non-domestic change of occupier process and for all energy suppliers that do have that license as well to supply non-domestic premises. Next question, is there a written definition of reasonable request? Every supplier could have a different opinion of what is reasonable. So there are lists of documents that can be requested set out in the schedule and further examples in the guidance document. However, as part of this solution development of 155 and particularly at the working group, it was recognised that the list could not fit every scenario, but they are designed to cover as many as possible and they have also been legally reviewed as well. We can sort of maybe address this as well through the guidance document further if need be. That guidance document can be updated as well if further documentation needs to be added as examples, or if the code manager needs to further clarify, for example, the definition of reasonable request, we can look into that and can do so when required. When will suppliers get the detail on the data that they need to build for the reporting for performance assurance? Obviously, party has noted we have a readiness RFI, but still don't have the data reporting requirements. Anton, I see you've come on camera. Do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so reporting requirements will go through a proper change process. I think James shared the number earlier. So you should be able to see it track through that process all the way to implementation. So it should be predictable for you. Having said that, our goal is to avoid you having to generate something different to what you have to generate already, and to use the Ofgem RFI as the basis. The Ofgem RFI includes other information that's superfluous for this instance, so it would be taking the relevant pieces of that. So when that RFI comes out, if you just think about the bits that are relevant there and consider that that might need to be repeated more often, I think that's the way to think about it. Hopefully that is clear. I can't call out your name, unfortunately.
Here, Anton, can I pass the next one to you as well?
Sure. Well, there are two answers to that, and one is before and one is after, really. So before, we are looking in the information people provide us to understand how people are reasonable. As I said before, it is subtle. We definitely only want kind of legitimate coups to be approved, and it is reasonable for sometimes people to go back, but they do need to have appropriate guidance in line with the code to try and make sure that those are sensible and reasonable requests. Following this, we will be looking at real market outcomes, which involves how many coups there are that are approved and not approved, and we can follow things through the switching process. So we do expect to be looking to see if organizations are being reasonable. You know, you have to look at the individual case to tell, but there might be cases where people go back once and that's reasonable, maybe twice, but you shouldn't expect an iteration of 30 or 40 times, should you? That would not be sensible. And we will be looking at the kind of end-to-end cycle time, and this is less about the individual organization, the supplier in question. This is more about understanding if this process is effective and this change has met its goals, because we would expect kind of essentially faster and more reliable coups as a result of this change.
Very much, Anton. Colin, I'll come to your question now because I know you submitted it earlier in the session and we said we would discuss it at the end. So thank you for waiting on that one. Happy if Lorna or Glenn want to jump in on this one as well. If not, I'm happy to cover it. But if either of you have the schedule on the screen just to help us, that'd be much appreciated. Lorna, see you've come on camera.
I don't have it on screen. I did. Yeah, I wasn't sure if there's a way of getting it in a slide. The reason, right, let's read it out, shall I? So section 2.2, the energy supplier shall within 2 working days of receiving notification of a change of occupier, and then determine if it's been a change of occupier, determine it hasn't been, or request additional information. The reason that we've gone for those 3 options is that it's to help drive the communication with the person who's submitted the request. You're either going to accept them, you don't even need to ask for documentation, you can do it immediately, and you accept it, or you request the documentation and you accept it. You can decide outright that it's basically false, fraudulent, or whatever decisions those are, or it's not enough and you ask for additional information. Those are to allow a clear determination point on the SLA. Anything else would delay the SLA and cause you problems with your reporting. Yeah, Colin, I see you've got your hand up if I'm not answering what you've meant.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much time on this. Maybe it's one to take offline, but it's just, you know, it's very clear in what's been presented today. The line is it's 10 working days from receipt of the documentation, but 2.2 does allow for a different situation. I think it's probably, if somebody gave me a ready packed COT with all the documentation attached, then I should be able to approve that straight away, I guess.
Yeah.
But do I actually have 10 working days? So it's like if I get a perfect pre-pack, I've got 10 working days to approve it. If I don't get a perfect pre-pack, I can ask for some documentation, and then I've got 10 working days to approve it.
Yes, everything that's 10 working days is on the supplier's receipt of that documentation. It does not include the time it takes somebody to get it to you.
I think I understand it. I think that makes sense. It's just a little bit different how it's worded between the guidance and the schedule.
Okay. We'll have a look at that, and we can update the guidance to make sure it matches the legal text.
Yeah, thanks, Lorna.
Okay.
Just to note as well, part of the reason we have this guidance document is obviously the schedule is legal text, and I know I'm not a lawyer myself, and I understand that sometimes the legal text can be a little tricky to understand. So the purpose of the guidance documents is obviously to translate that into plain English as well, but we will review it to make sure that it still is providing the same set of instructions. Just good, Ben, thank you for your question. Probably one for Anton, but I'll just skip to Christopher's quickly because I can answer that very quickly. So all the reporting on the change of occupier process has been descoped from 155. There is still the requirement for suppliers to respond to the current information request that Anton set out earlier in the webinar. For Ben's question now, I see there's a few thumbs up as well. Ben, I hope I'm correct in assuming that this is the request for information, the assurance information request, rather than the off-gem request for information based on the wording of the question.
That's right. Apologies, my spelling's horrific, but
no. In that case, Anton, if I can ask you to take this one, please.
Yeah. So I do agree prepayment levelization was really important. It just is different to this one. We can tell centrally when you submit to RECO.
I don't get that at all. Prepayment levelization's got a hell of a lot of money associated to it. And we sign a compliance statement every year to say we're compliant. If we end up having to do this for every code change, it's just totally burdensome.
Ben, they definitely won't need to do this for every code change, but here are some of the factors why PML is a different game. We can tell if it's working centrally. When you submit information to RECO for PML, there's validation that flags up if there are errors. It tends to be an interaction between a central body and an individual organization, the PML, whereas this change is actually about the interaction between the supplier and the getting and losing supplier and the consumer at the end of that. We can't see that centrally. I think that's one of the reasons why that needs to happen. And the benefits accrue differently here. Prepayment levelization has a totally different set of benefits to this. I think it's really important that we understand whether this is working and these changes are driving those benefits. We can see that centrally for PML, so it's kind of a different game. So like, I do appreciate the kind of intent of this, which is let's make sure information requests are proportionate. I hear that bit. I think PML is a different change with different risks associated with it. But I definitely hear your.
That was just an example, Anton, prepayment. But yeah, we can have a chat offline about it.
I'm happy to, but I definitely take the point. We recognise that doing this for changes is burdensome. It does include work for you guys, but I think it's important that we focus on the key risks to the consumers.
Thank you, Anton, and thank you, Ben, for your question. I am conscious that it is 1 minute to 2, so I see there are still a few questions on Slido, and I think they've been answered by our moderators. Again, there'll be an opportunity to refer back to these questions and the answers in the summary documentation that we will attach to the session materials. So I think we'll put a pin in that for now. Thank you all for your questions. And thank you all for attending.